This week's story is called Rare Bird. It was past midnight in June of 2020 in Sandusky, Ohio, and 25-year-old Lauren Wells lay in her bed wide awake. She had to be up early for work and had been trying to fall asleep for hours, but all night long, the faint sound of music coming from her upstairs neighbors had made sleep impossible. The tune they kept playing was extremely irritating. Sometimes it was very generic sounding, like elevator music. Then it seemed to switch to some kind of strange experimental jazz. Lauren had just moved into her apartment and didn't want to cause any trouble with her new neighbors, but they clearly were not stopping anytime soon. So she finally climbed out of bed and grabbed her broom. She was just about to knock on the ceiling with her broom when the direction of the music suddenly changed. Now it sounded like it was coming from next door. Lauren shook her head in frustration. She didn't want to start a fight with the entire complex, so she climbed back into her bed and threw her pillow over her head. She could still hear the music, but eventually she drifted off to sleep. The next morning at 8 a.m., Lauren arrived at her job as a nursing home administrator. She had just been hired 2 months ago, and she was proud that she'd gotten this position at such a young age. Running the nursing home was Lauren's dream job. She loved interacting with the elderly residents and wanted to make a difference in their lives. So even though she was running on fumes at this point from a lack of sleep, Lauren pushed through the day, checking in on staff and residents, and running various meetings. Thankfully, it was a Friday, so Lauren had the weekend to look forward to. She and her friends were heading to one of the islands off of Lake Erie, which is one of the Great Lakes. Lauren hoped some time outdoors would help her regain some energy. And the weekend getaway was just what she needed. The sun was out, there was a gentle breeze over the lake, and the water was cool and refreshing. Lauren was excited to reconnect with her best friends, and on their first night out, they went out to dance and have some drinks. She forgot about work and her annoying neighbors and just enjoyed herself. But as the evening progressed, Lauren found herself using the bathroom more than usual, but she figured it was just because she was drinking. A little while later, when she was on the dance floor, she felt a sharp pain on her left side. The pain stayed with her the rest of the night. She thought it was menstrual cramps and did her best to ignore them. Nothing was going to stop her from having a fun weekend. And by the time she got home Sunday night, she was feeling better, just like she had hoped. But soon after Lauren stepped into her apartment, her good mood evaporated. Her neighbors were playing that annoying elevator music again. The faint melodies seemed to be coming from everywhere and nowhere at the same time. Lauren dropped her bags and shook her head. She wasn't going to let this upset her. It was late and she knew she needed to get some sleep. So she unpacked and got ready for bed. But just like before, it was impossible to relax with that music coming through the walls. She tossed and turned for hours until finally exhaustion overtook her. When Monday morning rolled around, Lauren was definitely not feeling well. She figured she was paying for her weekend of partying, so she tried to shake it off. She made herself a cup of coffee and got on the treadmill for her daily run. But she'd only been on the treadmill for a minute when once again she felt an intense pain in her left side and had to stop running. It almost felt like someone was punching her hard, but from the inside. This pain went far beyond menstrual cramps. She figured something else had to be going on. Lauren thought back to everything she did at Lake Erie. She wondered if she had pulled a muscle while she was out swimming. It didn't seem likely, but she couldn't think of anything else that would explain the pain. Lauren had no idea how she was going to get through the day, much less the week, but she didn't want to call in sick. She was still new to her job, and people were counting on her. So she slowly got dressed while wincing in pain and got ready for work. And as she did, she thought to herself, at least her neighbors weren't playing that god-awful music. Once Lauren arrived at work, she did her morning rounds and sat down at her desk to take care of some paperwork. But as hard as she tried, she just couldn't focus. There was something distracting her. It was that weird music she kept hearing in her apartment. It made no sense that the same music would be playing in the nursing home. Lauren looked around just to see if there were any speakers nearby, but there was none. She tried to ignore the disjointed melody, but it was impossible. It seemed like it was coming from everywhere. But then she realized something that made her heart start racing. If there really wasn't any music actually playing right now, that could only mean one thing. The music was only happening in her head. She wondered if she was going crazy, but before she jumped to any conclusions, Lauren thought of someone who might be able to help her. She had a friend who was an audiologist, which is a doctor that specializes in hearing. Lauren called her right away and explained what was going on. She described the strange, repetitive sound and said it was following her everywhere. Lauren's friend listened patiently, then told her that what she was describing sounded upsetting, but it actually wasn't uncommon. She promised that Lauren was not going crazy. She said that sometimes people can hear melodies in everyday noises like busy traffic or the hum of air conditioners, and just like songs that get stuck in your head, these sounds can do the same thing. Since Lauren was clearly so tired, she was probably more susceptible to hearing these noises. Her friend was sure that once Lauren just got some quality sleep, this weird music she was hearing would go away. Lauren was relieved, but also frustrated. The music was actually the thing keeping her from sleeping in the first place. But she was glad to know that if she could just get some rest, maybe her life would go back to normal. As the week went by, Lauren did her best to stay relaxed, but the music in her head just would not stop, and it continued to make sleep nearly impossible. And so a few days after talking to her friend, Lauren again dragged herself to work, and as she headed down the hall toward her office, she noticed a new odd sensation. Her hands felt like they were covered in a thick layer of dirt, and they felt sticky too, almost as if a glue stick had melted in her palm. She kept scrubbing her hands with soap and hot water, but she couldn't get them to feel clean. Lauren was totally confused. She'd never felt anything like this before. And it wasn't long before that same sensation spread to her feet. Lauren felt like her socks were glued to her toes. At first, it was just a little bit irritating, but then it became totally unbearable. She started going barefoot at work, which helped a little bit. She realized it was weird, but she couldn't stand the thought of putting her shoes and socks back on. Lauren was afraid that there was a connection between her auditory hallucinations and now her hands and feet feeling dirty all the time. But she had no idea what that connection could be. Lauren's instinct was telling her to go see a doctor, but she imagined how ridiculous it would all sound. She hung on to what her friend, the audiologist, had told her about feeling better with some rest. And so Lauren convinced herself that this was the weekend she would finally get some sleep and all these problems would just finally go away. That Saturday night, more than 2 weeks after her strange symptoms had begun, Lauren climbed into bed exhausted. She tried to ignore the strange soundtrack playing in her head, her sticky hands and feet, and the dull pain still in her left side. She pulled the comforter up to her chin, and she tried to meditate, letting the sounds of birds outside her window lull her to sleep. But after a few minutes, Lauren's eyes flew open. She realized that the birds singing outside her window were seagulls. Seagulls live near water, and there was not an ocean or a lake anywhere near her. The seagulls got louder and louder, and finally sounded like they might just fly right into her room at any second. Lauren knew that no amount of rest was going to make them go away, because just like the music, these squawking seagulls were in her head. She couldn't wait any longer. She needed to see a doctor. Almost 500 miles away in Easton, Pennsylvania, Lauren's father, Brad, was sound asleep at home when his phone rang. He saw Lauren's name on the caller ID and felt his stomach tighten. She wouldn't be calling so late if something wasn't wrong. After he answered the phone, Lauren told him what had been going on for the past couple of weeks. She had reached the point where she was so worried about her symptoms that she was heading to the emergency room to get checked out. Brad could hear the panic in her voice, and that made him scared. He was fully awake now, calculating how long it would take him to drive to Ohio. He jumped out of bed and reached for his clothes, telling Lauren he was on his way, but she told him he should stay home. She wanted to see what the doctor had to say before he made such a long trip. Brad reluctantly agreed to hold off, but he told Lauren to call as soon as she had any answers. 30 minutes after talking to her father, Lauren arrived at the emergency room. She took a breath and then described her symptoms to the admissions nurse, expecting to get some strange looks. But the nurse just nodded and took some notes. Then Lauren was sent back to see a doctor, who performed an exam and drew her blood. Lauren waited anxiously as they processed her results. And after a little while, the doctor approached Lauren's hospital bed. She searched his face, looking for any sign of concern, but his expression seemed totally relaxed. He told Lauren that her tests were completely normal. He didn't think anything was really wrong with her. As he spoke, he flipped through her chart and asked about her work. She explained she'd recently moved and started a new job. The doctor nodded and said he understood, and he said, Lauren, you're probably just stressed. And then he prescribed her some anti-anxiety medication, and he gave her an order to see a psychiatrist. Lauren was frustrated with the doctor's diagnosis, but he seemed to be certain there wasn't anything else going on with her. So Lauren left the ER feeling somewhat unsettled, and on the way home, she called her father, Brad. Lauren could always rely on him to be supportive and honest with her. She told him how annoyed she was that all these doctors just assumed she was stressed because of her new job. But she was thriving there and loved the new challenge. It didn't make sense to put the blame solely on stress. Her dad said he totally understood her frustration, but the doctors knew what they were doing. He asked Lauren to at least start taking the anti-anxiety medication. With any luck, they'd let her get some sleep, and then at that point, with a clear head, she could reassess her situation. Lauren was not convinced, but she promised her dad that she would try. Later that week, Lauren drove to work as usual. She'd been taking her anxiety medication, but so far, it really wasn't helping. She still heard all the mysterious music playing everywhere she went, and so she really wasn't getting more than an hour or two of sleep at night. She gulped down some strong black coffee, but nothing could cut through her brain fog. She'd been a zombie at work all week, often losing track of what she was supposed to be doing. Lauren turned into the parking lot, pulled into her parking spot, and then got out of her car, and as she walked towards the building, she left the engine running and her keys in the ignition, and her laptop and purse were still on the passenger seat. Lauren entered the conference room in a daze. She felt like she was moving in slow motion, and she barely registered the team of nurses who were already there for the weekly staff meeting. Lauren sat down at the table and tried to read the agenda, but the words looked like a jumble of hieroglyphics. At some point, Lauren tried to say something, but nothing came out of her mouth. She looked at the faces of her colleagues, who were now staring at her in confusion, and suddenly, Lauren realized she had no idea how she had gotten there or what she was supposed to do. The nurses who were at the meeting with Lauren could tell something was wrong with her. They helped Lauren lie down on a nearby sofa and took her blood pressure, which was extremely high. She could hear another nurse calling 911. Lauren tried not to panic, but the fear was overwhelming. Then her mind went totally blank. By the time the ambulance arrived, Lauren was starting to come out of her trance-like state. The fog that had been clouding her mind had lifted, and she felt more clear-headed than she had in a long time. She insisted that she did not need to go to the hospital, but the staff wouldn't hear of it. And so, after some gentle coaxing, they convinced Lauren to get in the ambulance. The paramedics took Lauren to a local hospital where doctors ran a series of tests. As she waited for the results, she felt surprisingly calm. She was so relaxed that she began texting her friends to come hang out with her in the hospital. She said she was having a great time. Lauren's friends were taken aback by these text messages. They knew what she was going through, and this just didn't sound like her at all. A little while later, Lauren's father, Brad, was busy at work when his cell phone rang. He'd been on edge the whole week, worrying about his daughter. When he saw it wasn't her number, he felt relieved. But then he realized the person calling him had an area code from Sandusky, the town where Lauren lived. Brad's stomach tightened as he answered. It was one of Lauren's friends. She told Brad that Lauren was in the hospital and that she was not doing well. This time, Brad didn't hesitate. He raced home, threw some clothes in a suitcase, and sped off to make the 7-hour drive to Sandusky. Meanwhile, Lauren was waiting at the hospital for more test results. One of her close friends, who had come to the ER, was sitting next to her. When the doctor came back to Lauren, he gave her some good news. Her test results had all come back negative, just like before. They couldn't explain what had happened to her at work, but physically she was fine and she could be discharged. Lauren thanked him, then she turned to her friend and said that it must have been another false alarm. But Lauren could tell her friend still looked worried. And deep in her heart, Lauren knew she wasn't okay, no matter what these tests said. Her symptoms might have temporarily gone away, but they were going to return, and as she thought about that, she began to feel this terrible dread come over her. Lauren asked the doctor if there was any other alternative to being discharged. The doctor hesitated, and then he said yes, there was, but it was drastic. Seven hours later, Brad finally arrived at the hospital in Sandusky, and he raced to the admissions desk. Just moments earlier, his daughter had called him with the stunning news that she was admitting herself into the psychiatric ward of the hospital, and so Brad, all he wanted to do was just get to his daughter. Once he entered the patient area, Brad was greeted by a doctor and brought to Lauren's room, but he was only allowed to see her through a shatterproof glass window on her locked door, and what he saw shook him to the core. Lauren was writhing on the floor, screaming and begging to be let out. She was trying to tear off her shirt. Food was splattered on the walls, and an empty tray and plate were upside down on the floor. Brad was stunned. Lauren had called him just a couple of hours earlier and seemed fairly clear-headed, and so he didn't understand how her condition could have changed so drastically. The doctor explained that he was giving Lauren medicine to treat schizophrenia, which is a serious mental disorder that causes people to hallucinate and experience delusions. They'd already started on her medication, but it would need time to take effect. Brad shook his head in disbelief. There was no history of mental illness in their family, and Lauren had always been so happy and well-adjusted. The doctor could only shrug. Schizophrenia did have a tendency to run in families, but it also struck out of the blue, usually in young adults anytime between their late teens and early 20s, and Lauren was 25. The diagnosis was terrifying. Brad was desperate to do something to help, but all he could do was wait for Lauren's medication to kick in. It was early in the morning when Brad left the hospital after Lauren had finally calmed down. He checked into a nearby hotel and sank into an exhausted sleep, thinking about his daughter and praying that she would be back to her normal self by the time he woke up. After sleeping for a few hours, Brad returned to the hospital, and when he got there, the nurse gave him a rundown of Lauren's condition. She said Lauren had begged the staff to use their hospital phone, and then when they said yes, she had called friends and relatives repeatedly, forgetting she'd already spoken with them. She'd also become very aggressive with the hospital staff. Brad insisted on going into his daughter's room, so they unlocked her door and he walked in softly, not wanting to scare her. Lauren was sitting on a rumpled bed staring into the distance. Her hair was disheveled and there were dark circles under her eyes. He almost didn't even recognize her. Brad struggled to stay calm as he sat down next to Lauren. He tried to comfort her and asked her if she needed anything, but she didn't respond. The medications she was on didn't seem to be working, but the doctor said it could take a while to kick in. Without anything else to hold on to, Brad clung on to that hope. Over the next few days, Brad anxiously waited for Lauren to improve as doctors tried different combinations of medications. But on the fifth night after Lauren was admitted to the psych ward, things got even worse. Brad had gone back to his hotel, and in a routine that had become too familiar, a phone call startled him awake. It was someone from the hospital. Lauren had experienced a massive seizure and was being transferred to the ICU for further testing. Brad ran to his car, and by the time he arrived at the ICU, Lauren was heavily sedated. He flagged down a doctor in the hall and bombarded her with questions, but it was clear that the doctor was just as much in the dark as he was. All she knew was that Lauren was in critical condition, and they were trying to figure out what was wrong. Afterward, in the waiting room, Brad called friends and family to update them. He tried to piece together everything that had happened to her in the last several weeks, hunting for any clues that might explain her illness. but all he had was a long list of strange symptoms and events. Brad didn't know what to do, but he was desperate for answers, and so he began mentally going through his list of friends who might have some perspective that could be useful right now about Lauren. And as he did this, one name came up that he and Lauren both had in common: Ken Zemanek. Ken was the father of twin girls who were Lauren's best friends from childhood, and he was also a psychiatrist. And so Brad hoped Ken could provide some perspective about Lauren's mental state. When he got Ken on the phone, Brad was afraid that Ken would tell him the same things as all the other doctors, that it was possible Lauren had schizophrenia, or that Brad just needed to be patient and wait for more test results. But once Brad finished going through Lauren's extensive list of strange symptoms, Ken didn't say a word. After a long pause, he said that the hallucinations and mood swings did point to a mental issue. But what troubled Ken was the seizure. Schizophrenia couldn't have caused that to happen. Ken paused again, and then told Brad he did have another thought, one that could potentially explain everything that had been happening to Lauren. He described it as a, quote, rare bird, or extremely rare condition. He suggested that Brad ask Lauren's doctors to test her for this rare condition. Brad listened intently. It was a long shot, but it was all he had. After Brad hung up with Ken, Brad Googled anything he could find about this rare disease Ken had mentioned. And the more he read about it, the more convinced he became that it was what was happening to Lauren. Brad headed straight to the nurse's station and asked to speak with one of Lauren's doctors right away. For the first time since Lauren's nightmare had started, he felt a real glimmer of hope. The on-duty doctor arrived, and Brad told him about his conversation with Ken Zemanek. But the doctor was hesitant to test for it right away. The condition Brad described was incredibly unusual, and they needed to test for more common conditions first. Brad immediately tried speaking with another one of Lauren's doctors to see if maybe they would test for it, but that doctor said the same thing. They were going to test for common things first. And this doctor would say that in their entire career, they had never seen a patient with something that rare before. And so a parade of specialists marched in and out of Lauren's room, but every test they ran was inconclusive. As the hours ticked by, Brad's frustration grew. The next morning, Brad arrived at the hospital and headed straight to the ICU. As he walked down the hallway leading to Lauren's room, he heard a commotion of voices and the sound of beeping monitors. He ran into his daughter's room and saw a team of doctors hovering over Lauren. She was lying motionless on the bed and her eyes were closed. Brad stood there in shocked silence until a doctor noticed him and rushed over. He told Brad that Lauren's vital signs were dropping and they were working to get her stabilized. And so Brad needed to leave and go to the waiting area until the situation was under control. But Brad was sick of waiting in a medical twilight zone. His daughter was on the verge of death and they still had no idea what was wrong with her. He demanded they run the tests that he had requested about this rare illness. The doctor hesitated, but then nodded. He finally admitted that they were hitting a total brick wall and were at an absolute loss. But they were at a small community hospital, and so their resources were very limited to both test and treat Lauren for this rare condition if she were to have it. And so if Brad wanted to get her the help she needed, they'd have to transfer her to the Cleveland clinic, which was over an hour away. However, getting there was a huge risk. Lauren was so weak she could die on the transit. Brad was facing the biggest decision of his life, but he didn't hesitate. A few minutes later, Lauren was loaded into the back of an ambulance, headed for the Cleveland clinic. Brad followed behind in his car, praying his daughter could hold on just a little longer. When the ambulance finally arrived at the clinic, a medical team was waiting. Brad quickly parked his car and joined them as the team grabbed the gurney that Lauren was on and rushed her towards the entrance. Brad tried to stay calm as he watched them wheel her to the neurological ICU. Lauren's heartbeat barely registered, and she was having trouble breathing on her own. The doctors told Brad that her brain had also begun to swell, and so they needed to put her into a medically induced coma to help bring the swelling down. Lauren was given a strong sedative through an IV drip to put her into a state of unconsciousness. She was then hooked up to a ventilator that went into her mouth and down her throat to keep her breathing, and a feeding tube was inserted inside her nose and down into her stomach. Brad tried not to show how scared he was, but he knew Lauren was hanging on by a thread. Brad spent the next several hours anxiously pacing in the lobby of the ICU while the heads of several departments at the Cleveland Clinic teamed up in an attempt to save Lauren's life. Finally, one of Lauren's doctors walked in with the results of Lauren's newest round of tests. The doctor was incredulous. Brad and his good friend, Ken Zemanek, had been right. Lauren was sick with something that was so unheard of, most doctors would never think to even test for it. She had a disease called anti-NMDAR encephalitis. Anti-NMDAR is extremely rare, affecting only 1 out of 1.5 million people per year. It had only been identified 13 years earlier in 2007. The disease causes severe inflammation of the brain, which then results in hallucinations and a total psychotic breakdown. This explained almost all of Lauren's symptoms, like hearing the strange music and the seagulls and the sticky feelings on her hands and feet. But it turned out that NMDAR by itself wasn't what caused Lauren to get so sick. The doctor explained that the disease usually signified a deeper, even rarer underlying condition, which would have caused Lauren's other symptoms, like the pain in her side and the frequent need to urinate. Those symptoms were caused by a tumor in her ovary called a teratoma. Teratomas usually strike young women. This kind of tumor is made up of tissue from other parts of the body, like hair, muscle, nerve, organ, or bone. Normally, when the immune system recognizes a tumor in the body, it creates antibodies to try and kill it off. However, the specific type of antibodies formed from a teratoma can end up targeting more than just the tumor. They can also attack the brain and cause anti-NMDAR. In trying to defend her body against this tumor, Lauren's brain had accidentally attacked itself. Brad nearly collapsed from relief. They had a clear-cut answer for what Lauren was up against. It meant they weren't working in the dark. Now they just needed to get the tumor out. A surgeon removed the teratoma the next morning. It was 13 centimeters long, so more than 5 inches long. And unfortunately, it was malignant, which meant Lauren needed chemotherapy in order to fully recover. For the next 2 weeks, Lauren stayed in a medically induced coma. Once she was finally awakened, she couldn't remember anything that had happened to her. She had to relearn how to walk and how to talk, but day by day, she got stronger and was finally well enough to go home. 6 months later, Lauren got the news they'd all been hoping for. She was now officially cancer-free. After a full recovery, she went on to graduate from school and earned an advanced degree. Then, in April of 2022, she took a new job as executive director of a senior living facility. She never heard phantom elevator music or seagulls again. On the evening of February 6, 2014, 54-year-old entrepreneur Lexi Sachs lit 2 candles on top of a cake, then started singing Happy Birthday as she carried that cake out of the kitchen inside of her sprawling mansion in San Juan Capistrano, California. 3 of Andra's 5 children joined in the singing and followed their mom. Andra was 5 foot 11 inches tall with dyed blonde hair, and she was the type of person who could take over any room she walked into. So even a simple chorus of Happy Birthday with her kids felt like a big production whenever Andra was leading it. As Andra, her 2 teenage daughters, and her 8-year-old son continued to sing Happy Birthday, they walked past a wall of floor-to-ceiling windows. Their huge 3-story house sat on top of a hill, and the windows looked out over the Pacific Ocean. Then Andra and the kids walked into the dining room, where Andra's ex-husband, Brad, was sitting at the dining room table smiling. Brad was over 6 feet tall, he had salt and pepper hair, and he almost always had a tan. Andra put the cake down on the table, and then she and the kids finished singing Happy Birthday. Brad leaned over the cake and blew out the 2 candles that were shaped like a 5 and a 7. The kids cheered, and Brad thanked them all for singing. Andra smiled at Brad, but she noticed he was hiding his hands just below the dining room table. She knew why Brad was doing it. It was because he didn't want the kids to see the tremors that were making his hands shake. 2 years earlier, Brad had been diagnosed with Parkinson's disease, which is a disorder of the central nervous system that can include symptoms like muscle stiffness, loss of balance, and tremors. And recently, Brad's symptoms had gotten worse. The kids knew their dad was dealing with Parkinson's, and so they were used to the changes in his movement that the disease could cause. But that night, Brad was celebrating his 57th birthday, and he just wanted the kids to have a good time and not worry about him. So he kept his hands out of sight while Andra cut up pieces of the cake and handed them out to the kids. Then Andra sat down next to Brad at the table, and she rubbed his back. Andra watched the kids laughing and eating their cake. Then she told Brad she wished their two oldest sons, who were away at college, could have come home to visit for his birthday so the whole family could be together. Brad said it was all right, and he pointed out that before they knew it, the girls would go off to college, and their 8-year-old boy would grow up, and it would just be the two of them together most of the time, like it had been at the beginning of their relationship. Andra and Brad had met almost 25 years earlier when they were both starting out as entrepreneurs in the growing tech industry. They were both very smart, and they had great minds for business, but other than that, they seemed like they didn't have much in common. Andra had grown up without a lot of money. In fact, there had been times as a child when her parents struggled just to make mortgage payments. As she got older, Andra had told herself she never wanted to experience anything like that when she was out on her own. So after she earned a business degree in college, she had worked hard to develop her sales skills and to learn about as many industries as she could in the hope that she would always have job security. Andra was full of energy, she could talk to anybody, and she could be intimidating. And those traits had helped her find success as a salesperson at a pretty young age. But Andra was also driven and fixated on success, so she had wanted to be her own boss and to make even more money. So by the time Andra had met Brad, she was already formulating plans to start and run her own company. Brad had first seen this tall, stunning, laser-focused woman at a computer convention back in 1990, and he was totally floored by her. Unlike Andra, Brad had come from money. He was the son of a legendary Southern California surfer, and Brad had wanted to follow in his dad's footsteps. So he'd spent a big part of his life traveling and surfing waves on beaches all over the world. And Brad embraced the laid-back surfer attitude. He almost never raised his voice, he never looked like he was in a hurry to get anywhere, and nothing really seemed to stress him out. And so when Andra and Brad had met, it really was a case of opposites attracting. Brad had been drawn to Andra's drive and energy, and Andra had been drawn to Brad's kind of quiet, calm demeanor. The two had gotten married a year after they met, and they'd started a family soon after that. They had their first son, Miles, and he was followed 2 years later by his brother, Ashton. Then, a few years after that, Andra and Brad's first daughter, Lexi, was born. In the dining room, Andra and Brad watched 17-year-old Lexi gather up wrapped birthday presents with her 8-year-old brother, Landon. Andra appreciated that Lexi went out of her way to take care of her little brother because Andra spent a lot of time working and she wasn't always around. And as Brad's Parkinson's progressed, it was more difficult for him to do certain things around the house and to look after Landon all the time. But there was something about watching Lexi with Landon that always made Brad and Andra a little sad. It wasn't the kids' fault, but seeing them together brought up memories of the worst time in Brad and Andra's lives. Less than a year after Lexi had been born, Andra and Brad had welcomed another daughter, and as their family grew, their businesses had grown alongside it. Andra and Brad had started multiple companies together and also separately on their own. Then, Andra had used some of the profits from one of her companies to invest in rental properties and to build a massive real estate portfolio. In her time as an entrepreneur, Andra had often said it was easy to make money, but keeping it was the hard part. So she saw real estate as a way to protect her and her family's money and to build on the wealth that she had started to make from her other businesses. It turned out that Andra was a very savvy real estate investor, and soon after getting into that business, her investment properties were bringing in millions of dollars. So Andra, who had been determined never to face the financial struggles her parents had gone through, felt like she had already accomplished more than she could have hoped for. She was making more money than she had ever imagined, and she and Brad had just bought their first house together. It was a modest house compared to the mansion on the hill they would move into years later, but it had a beautiful pool and also had a hot tub. And the happiest part of Andra's life was that she and Brad had 2 perfect sons and 2 perfect daughters. But on a day in 1999, 15 years before Brad's family birthday party, 2-year-old Lexi and her 16-month-old sister had been at home with a nanny while Andra and Brad were working and the two boys were at school. While the nanny fed the baby in her high chair, Lexi had walked out of the house into the backyard and onto the deck by the pool and the hot tub. Inside the house, the nanny had seen Lexi out the window, so she grabbed the baby from the high chair and rushed outside. Lexi was close to the pool, and the nanny panicked. She put the baby down on the deck and then reached out and grabbed Lexi. But when the nanny had grabbed Lexi, the baby had somehow fallen off the deck into the hot tub and drowned. Following the death of their youngest child, Andra and Brad felt like everything they built together had just been destroyed. It didn't take long for them to start blaming each other for what had happened, and the tensions at home spilled into their work, and pretty soon each of them had tried to push the other one out of the businesses they owned together, and their marriage fell apart. Andra and Brad had gotten divorced, but things had only gotten worse from there. They had sued each other over business assets and personal finances, and Andra had even filed a report with police stating that Brad had tried to physically assault her. During this time, their 3 living children, Miles, Ashton, and Lexi, had clung to each other for support and tried to make both of their parents happy. Miles, the oldest, had seen himself as the one in charge, the one who was responsible for taking care of his younger siblings, and the other kids followed Miles's lead. But only a couple of years after the ugly divorce, Andra and Brad reconciled. Their friends and family had been shocked, but Andra and Brad seemed happy, and they had moved into the mansion on the hill in San Juan Capistrano that Andra had bought with money from her real estate investments. So the family was back together again. And then Andra and Brad had expanded the family by adopting Landon and his older sister. But after the divorce, Andra had sworn she would never share her money with Brad again, so she and Brad had not gotten remarried, and the house and most of the family's assets were still under Andra's name. In the dining room, Lexi and Landon brought in one final birthday present for Brad. It wasn't wrapped, but it had a bow on it, and when Brad saw it, he lit up. It was a large water bicycle designed to let him ride the ocean waves while sitting on top of it. Parkinson's disease had taken surfing away from Brad, but now, with this water bicycle, he'd be able to get back in the water. He thanked the kids for the great birthday party, then he turned to Andra, gave her a kiss, and thanked her for the incredible gift. They both knew a lot of people did not understand their relationship, an ex-husband and wife living together without getting remarried or sharing their money, but they didn't care, because Andra and Brad believed that they and their kids were as happy, successful, and loving as a family could be. On February 8th, 2014, so 2 nights after the birthday party, Andra helped Brad to their bedroom on the 3rd floor of the house. They hadn't told their younger kids yet, but Andra had recently purchased a new 1-story property, and she was going to sell the home they lived in. Andra and Brad knew the kids would be disappointed to move out of the mansion on top of the hill, but it was getting too hard for Brad to deal with the size of the house and to navigate all the stairs, and so Andra wanted a place where he could get to everything he needed on just 1 floor. While Andra and Brad went to their bedroom, 17-year-old Lexi walked into her little brother Landon's room on the 3rd floor and said goodnight to him as he got ready for bed. Then Lexi and her 15-year-old sister played with the family dogs and talked about school for a little bit before Lexi headed to her own bedroom, which was just down the hall from her brother's. Lexi got dressed for bed, she laid down, she looked at her phone and sent a couple of text messages to friends. After a while, she put her phone on the bedside table, flipped off the lamp, and then went to sleep. A few hours later, at about 1:45 in the morning, Lexi woke up, startled. She thought she heard a loud noise coming from down the hall, but she didn't know if it was real or if maybe she'd been dreaming. Then, Lexi heard something bang against her bedroom door, and the door flew open. Without thinking, Lexi immediately held her breath and pulled the covers up over her head like she had done when she was a kid when she got scared. She heard a loud noise, but obviously couldn't see it, and then something smashed into the wall just above her. Lexi tried her best just to be totally still and not make a sound, but then she heard footsteps running down the hallway, followed by her little brother Landon screaming. Hearing her brother calling out made Lexi jump into action. She threw the covers off of her, she got out of her bed, ran into the hallway, and she saw Landon lying on his chest a few feet outside of his bedroom in the hallway,
and he was screaming and crying and saying he couldn't feel his legs. Then Lexi heard footsteps again coming from behind her, and immediately her body tensed up. But then she turned around and saw it was just her sister running towards her. Lexi yelled for her sister to go call 911, so her sister turned around and ran back to her room on the second floor to get her phone and make the call. Lexi turned around and looked down at Landon and promised him he would be just fine and that she needed to go somewhere, but she'd be right back. And then she turned and ran down the hall towards her parents' room. And when Lexi got inside, her screams carried across the entire house. "45 minutes later, at about 2:30 in the morning, Detectives Justin Montano and Mike Thompson of the Orange County Sheriff's Department drove past a set of large palm trees as they headed up the hill towards Andra and Brad's house. The house was surrounded by a wall with a gate, but the gate was open. Detective Montano drove through the open gate, and he and Thompson saw an ambulance and several squad cars parked out front. The detectives stepped out of their car and looked up at the 3-story mansion. Both of these detectives had handled cases in similar Orange County neighborhoods, but they were still taken aback by some of these huge multi-million-dollar properties like the Sachs' house. Montano and Thompson made their way up to the mansion and walked inside. One of the first officers who had arrived at the scene met them and led them through the foyer to a large staircase and up to the 3rd floor. Montano and Thompson walked down the 3rd floor hallway past Lexi's bedroom, and they saw members of the forensics team examining spots of blood on the floor outside of Landon's room. The detectives followed the officer to the main bedroom at the end of the hall. The door was open, so before they even stepped into the room, they could see inside, and they could see there was blood covering the back wall. And they could see there were 2 bodies still lying in the bed. They were Andra and Brad, and they both were deceased. Montano thanked the officer for leading them to the bedroom, and then he and Thompson stepped into the room and walked towards the bed. Neither of them could get over the amount of blood that was covering the sheets. Montano thought this looked more like a gangland hit than a typical homicide. A ballistics expert waved the detectives over and showed them multiple bullet casings he'd already found in the room, but there was no murder weapon left at the scene. Montano went back to the officer who had led them to the bedroom and asked him what he and the paramedics had found when they first entered the house. The officer said the victims' 3 children who lived in this house had all gathered in the hallway right outside of their parents' bedroom. The officer said it appeared that the 2 teenage girls were okay, but the 8-year-old boy had lost feeling and movement from the waist down. All 3 kids have been taken to the hospital. Montano nodded and thanked the officer again for his help. Then Montano and Thompson looked at the scene on the bed again, and for some reason they both had the same thought. Did the 2 teenage girls murder their parents and maybe paralyze their little brother in the process? The idea of that upset both detectives, but they couldn't rule it out. The detectives had a theory that the motive for most murders boiled down to one of 3 things: money, sex, or revenge. And in a mansion like this, in such a wealthy neighborhood, there was definitely a chance that the kids had gone after their parents to maybe get their money. So after spending hours at the crime scene and organizing a canvass of the neighborhood, Montano and Thompson decided to really begin their investigation by talking to the Sachs children. That morning, a few hours after Andra and Brad's bodies had been discovered, their 19-year-old son, Ashton, was sitting on his couch playing a video game inside of his 1-bedroom condo in Seattle, Washington. Ashton was lanky, with straight brown hair that hung down over his forehead. It was a Sunday afternoon, and one of Ashton's favorite things to do on Sundays was to sit on his couch, smoke a little pot, and play the video game League of Legends for hours on end. And so he was doing that when his phone rang on the coffee table, and he glanced down from the TV and he saw it was his older brother, Miles, calling him. So Ashton paused his game and he answered his phone. The 2 brothers both lived in Washington, but they attended colleges on opposite sides of the state, so they didn't get to hang out very much. But they still made it a point to check in with each other fairly frequently, and they got along reasonably well, even though they were not really alike. Miles, who was 21 years old, had always been seen by his siblings as the golden boy of the family, and he definitely took after his mom when it came to business. Miles was already managing some of his mother's real estate properties in Washington, and he had dreams of starting his own company someday, just like his parents had done. Ashton was way more into computers than he was into business, so he'd gone to college in Seattle to study computer science, and he hoped he'd be able to get into a tech or gaming company when he was a bit older. When Ashton put the phone to his ear, he heard Miles's voice cracking on the other end, and he couldn't understand anything Miles was saying. Ashton asked Miles to slow down and to tell him what was going on. Then Miles, somewhat point blank, told Ashton that their parents had been found murdered, their brother was now in the hospital and couldn't feel his lower half, and their sisters were now talking to the police. Ashton just sat there in silence for a second. Then Miles told him he needed to fly home immediately and help take care of their younger siblings. Ashton had always seen Miles as the leader among the Sachs children. After all, Miles was the oldest and their parents had always trusted him, so Ashton, who was clearly in shock, said he would do whatever Miles thought was the right thing to do. Later that day, Miles and Ashton both flew from Washington to Orange County, California, and after they both arrived, they immediately went to the hospital to check on their brother, who was still in recovery, and then they reached out to the police. Several hours after they had arrived in Orange County, Miles and Ashton, the two oldest Sachs children, sat down in an office at the sheriff's station to talk to Detectives Montano and Thompson. Miles was significantly taller than his brother Ashton. He wore a dress shirt and slacks, and he had brown curly hair. Earlier that day, Montano and Thompson had talked to the boys' sisters, and they still considered them suspects, but police didn't have any evidence to hold them at that point. So the boys had gotten to see their sisters earlier, which made them feel a bit better than they had when they had left Washington. At the sheriff's station, Miles and Ashton looked like they were doing their best to hold everything together. But Montano and Thompson could tell, underneath their kind of tough exterior, they both seemed exhausted, and the detectives had no idea what they were going through after all they were hit with that day. So the detectives started by thanking the brothers for coming in, and then they gently asked them, where they had been when the rest of the family was at the house. Miles and Ashton explained that they had been in Washington, where they both went to college. Then Montano asked the brothers if they could think of anyone who might have had a grudge against their parents. Miles and Ashton looked at each other, and Miles nodded, and Ashton nodded back. It was like one of those moments where siblings can say a lot to each other without actually saying anything. Miles took a breath and then looked at Detective Montano and said there was a long list of people who had it out for their parents. A look of surprise came across both detectives' faces. In the short time they'd been working this case, everybody the police had talked to made it sound like Andra and Brad were very well liked and admired by just about everyone. But Miles said that just wasn't the case. He told detectives that his mother's very aggressive way of doing business had led her to make a lot of money and a lot of enemies over the years. There were investors who felt like Andra had cheated them out of money, there were clients who felt like she had ripped them off, and there were tenants in some of the rental properties Andra owned who believed she was an evil landlord. Miles thought most of the people who were angry at his mom were really just jealous of her success, or that they didn't understand how business worked. But once those people believed Andra had wronged them in some way, there was just no changing their minds. Then Montano asked if Miles or Ashton could name any particular person that was one of Andra and Brad's potential enemies. And Ashton said they would actually need a couple pieces of paper to be able to list everybody. By the end of the interview, Miles and Ashton had provided police with 2 pages filled with the names of previous business associates and renters who might have wanted to harm their parents. So detectives Montano and Thompson immediately went back to their theory that most murders are about money, sex, or revenge. Their first instinct had been that one of the Sachs kids might have wanted to get their parents' money, and so that was why they attacked them. But now, looking at all these names on these 2 pages, the detectives started to think that it was very likely that Brad and Andra might have been killed by someone who was out for revenge. In the days following Andra and Brad's murders, Montano and Thompson learned that the murder weapon had been a Ruger 22 semi-automatic rifle. So part of the investigative team focused on tracking down that weapon in the hope it would lead them to the killer. During that time, Montano and Thompson concentrated on the list of people that Miles and Ashton had provided them. And as they did this, the detectives discovered that there was even more anger towards Andra and Brad than their sons may have even realized. While searching social media, the detectives found multiple posts from people celebrating Andra and Brad's deaths. Most of the people posting were disgruntled renters who had lived in properties that Andra owned. So Montano added all those people who were making posts like that to their list of suspects and started to work through that list. But out of all the people they had looked into, from social media to the lists of names the brothers had given them, one group of people in particular stood out to the detectives. They were board members who had worked with Andra and Brad at one of the first successful companies they had started together. It turned out that years earlier, the board of directors had kicked Andra out of her own company because they said her business tactics and what they called her destructive raging were damaging the business. Andra had not left without a fight, and she had threatened to sue everybody involved with the company. And so finally, the board had just given her a payout of $9 million to walk away quietly. But when the company had faced bankruptcy, the board had started going after Andra in court to get the company's $9 million back. So Montano and Thompson saw these board members as people who wanted both money and revenge. The detectives met with individuals from the board, and they almost all said the same thing. They thought Andra was a terrible person to do business with, but they were horrified by what happened to her and her husband and her son. Those interviews also led to a list of even more past business associates who had grievances with Andra and Brad. And so Montano and Thompson felt like they really were just swimming in names of potential suspects, and they still hadn't even ruled out Brad and Andra's daughters. The investigative team was willing to methodically go through the entire suspect list if necessary, but Montano and Thompson believed if they could just track down the murder weapon, they could propel the investigation forward a lot faster. So they started to delve into the cell phone records of everybody they thought could possibly be connected to the murders. And they caught what looked like a huge break. A cell phone call had been placed from a car driving on the street at the bottom of the hill just outside of Brad and Andra's mansion around the same time the murders had taken place. But, just like the murder weapon, the car that the phone call had been made from seemed to have vanished. About a week after Andra and Brad's murders, 4 of their 5 kids, so all the siblings minus Landon, who was in the hospital, stood huddled together at the front of a church in between their parents' coffins. Over the past several days, those 4 siblings had barely left each other's sides, and they had spent most of their time with their little brother, Landon, in his hospital room, until they had finally gotten the good news that Landon was going to live. However, doctors said he would not walk again. At the funeral, Miles, the oldest sibling, spoke first about his unique relationship with his mother. He called her Andra and not Mom because he felt the connection they shared went beyond that of just mother and son. They were also friends and business partners, and Andra had always treated him as an equal. After Miles spoke, he went back over to his sisters and wrapped his arms around them. He was much, much taller than both of them, and so it almost looked, as they were standing there, like Miles was their father and not their brother. Then Ashton, the other brother, stepped forward and took a piece of paper out of his pocket, and as he read the eulogy from this piece of paper, you could see his hands shaking. Ashton spoke about how lucky he had been to have parents like Andra and Brad, but for most of the time that Ashton spoke, he spent his time talking about his little brother, Landon, and how whoever had done this had robbed an 8-year-old boy of the chance to grow up with a mom and dad, and how they had also robbed him of the use of his legs. It was just so tragic. After Ashton had finished talking, people in the church were openly sobbing as they offered condolences to all the kids. And even though those people knew the family had money, they wondered who would take care of the kids, and how they would ever move on from what had just happened to their parents. In the days following the funeral, the other Sachs siblings began to notice a change come over Miles. It was like he stopped being a normal older brother and switched into business mode like they had seen their mom do before. Miles met with authorities so that he and Ashton could obtain legal guardianship over their younger siblings. Then he moved all of the kids out of the mansion on the hill and into that one-story home Andra had bought with the intention of making Brad's life a bit easier. The other kids were angry about the move, but Miles said it was the right financial choice to make. This way, he could complete the sale of the mansion like his mom had intended, and the family would make millions of dollars. The kids were confused and upset, but they'd always looked up to Miles, and he seemed to have a clear plan, and he assured them that everything he was doing was in their best interest. So, in the span of a couple weeks, the Sachs kids had lost and buried their parents, and had moved out of their beloved house, and the younger kids had started having to answer to their own older brother, Miles, as if he was their parent. While Miles tried to get the family situated in their new home, he also reached out to his parents' lawyers to make sure he would have control of Andra's rental properties. Again, Miles said everything he was doing was just to make sure the rest of the kids would be taken care of and that they wouldn't have to worry about their financial futures now that their parents were gone. But even some of the kids' aunts and uncles thought Miles's behavior following the death of his parents was very bizarre. They understood that he did have a lot in common with Andra when it came to doing business, just being really aggressive and straightforward, but it almost seemed like he had already moved on from grieving, which just seemed impossible. Miles's actions didn't go unnoticed by police either, so Montano and Thompson returned to the idea that maybe money had been the motive for murder, and they wondered if maybe Miles had killed his parents just to get a hold of their financial assets and their companies. But Miles and also his brother Ashton's alibis had both checked out. People had seen them both in Washington on the morning of the murders. So Montano and Thompson just kept pursuing the two pieces of evidence that they thought would break the case wide open: the Ruger .22 semi-automatic rifle used in the murders, and the car that someone had placed a call from just outside of the mansion at the time of the murders. About 3 weeks into the investigation, Montano and Thompson were sitting together at the sheriff's station reviewing the steps they had taken so far. They were still pursuing every lead they had, including the seemingly countless number of enemies that Andra and Brad had made over their years of doing business. Just then, Montano's phone rang. He picked it up, and a member of the investigative team was on the other line, and the officer sounded excited. He said cell phone records had finally led them to a man who was in possession of the car that phone call outside of the Sachs house had been made from. Montano hung up, and the police got right to work securing a warrant to search the car that investigators had just tracked down. When the warrant came through, Montano and Thompson and other members of the team went to do a full search of the car. And when police popped the trunk of that car, they found a pile of clothes and also a Ruger semi-automatic rifle inside. They now knew who had murdered Andra and Brad. Based on cell phone records, interviews conducted throughout the investigation, and evidence found at the scene of the crime and in that car, here is a reconstruction of what police believe happened when somebody murdered Brad and Andra Sachs in the early morning hours of February 9th, 2014. At 1:30 a.m. on February 9th, the killer drove their white Toyota Prius slowly down the road at the bottom of the hill right below Andra and Brad's mansion. The Prius didn't make much noise, but the killer didn't really need to worry about being heard or seen anyway, because the Sachs' mansion was totally secluded and it sat on an acre of land, so nobody really lived that close to them. The killer parked the Prius at the bottom of the hill and stepped outside. There was a light, cool breeze coming off the ocean, and it was a very mild 60 degrees Fahrenheit. The killer wore jeans, a t-shirt, and gloves, and they had a knit hat pulled down almost to their eyes. The killer then walked around their car, opened the trunk, and pulled out a loaded Ruger semi-automatic rifle with a sling on it. The killer slung the rifle over his shoulder, closed the trunk, and then began walking up the hill towards the mansion. The moonlight shone through the palm trees, and the killer could hear waves crashing on the beach nearby. Everything felt so calm, but the killer's heart was pounding in their chest. The killer reached the top of the hill and came to the wall that surrounded the front of the house. The killer stretched out their arms and grabbed the top of the wall and then pulled themselves up and climbed over it into the front yard. The porch was lit, but the rest of the house looked dark. The killer stayed low and ran to the front door. They opened the door and walked into the large foyer in the front of the house. The huge windows allowed enough light into the house for the killer to clearly see the staircase leading up to the third floor. But the killer didn't move. Instead, they just stood there silently for several minutes. And then the killer began to pace around the first floor, deciding what to do next. Finally, after the killer had been on the first floor for nearly 15 minutes, they took a deep breath, they unslung their rifle, and marched upstairs to the third floor. The killer walked quickly down the hallway of the third floor towards the main bedroom. They hesitated when they reached the closed bedroom door. But after taking a breath to steady themselves, the killer reached down with one hand, they opened the door, they stepped into the open doorway, raised their rifle, and began to fire. Bullets riddled Andra and Brad while they slept, and blood spattered the walls and soaked the sheets. The killer had fired almost 25 bullets into the room before they stepped back out of the doorway. But when the killer stopped shooting Andra and Brad and they turned around, they saw a little boy running the opposite way down the hall. So the killer just raised the rifle again and fired off 2 shots, and the boy fell to the ground. Then the killer walked further down the hall, past the boy who was now writhing in pain on the ground, and came to another closed door. They kicked the door open and fired a shot blindly into the dark room. That bullet struck the wall just above the bed where 17-year-old Lexi was hiding under the covers. Then the killer heard the little boy he had shot screaming in the hall right behind him, so the killer just slung the gun on their back again, ran down the hall, and flew down the stairs. The killer reached the first floor, their head was pounding, their ears were ringing, and they were out of breath. But they heard movement on the floors above them, so they ran out the front door and across the yard. They reached the wall, pulled themselves up, and climbed over it. Then they ran down the hill back to their car. The killer opened the trunk, took the rifle off their back, and chucked it inside. They pulled off their knit hat as well and tossed it in with the gun. Then they took off all their clothes and chucked them in the trunk, and then grabbed some fresh clothes from the trunk and put those on. Then the killer hopped into the driver's seat of the Prius, started up the engine, and hit the gas. Then, as they were driving away from the house, the killer grabbed their cell phone from the passenger seat and made a quick call. The killer's head was still pounding, and they still felt like they couldn't breathe, but they knew their night was not over yet. So the killer tried to focus. They drove across town to an apartment building and pulled the Prius into a parking garage. They parked, got out of the car, and then walked a few minutes towards a major street nearby and found a cab waiting for them. The killer climbed inside, and the cab drove them to the airport. Hours later, at about 10 a.m., the killer landed in Washington State. They caught a cab at the airport and drove home. When they got home, they made sure their neighbors physically saw them, and they also texted one of their closest friends in the area just to make a show that they were in Washington and not in California. Then the killer headed inside of their place, sat down on the couch, turned on the TV, and started playing League of Legends. 19-year-old Ashton Sachs had murdered his parents, he had shot and paralyzed his little brother Landon, and fired a gun into his sister Lexi's room that easily could have hit her. It turned out Ashton had always deeply resented the way his parents treated his older brother, Miles. Ashton felt like Miles was treated like the golden boy, and his parents treated him, Ashton, like a failure. And that resentment had festered for years until Ashton started to consider murdering his parents in cold blood. Ashton went so far as to do serious research into different types of weapons and to figure out the differences between first and second-degree murder. Then Ashton had gone out and actually bought a semi-automatic rifle. But even after he'd gotten the gun, Ashton still wasn't sure he could actually go through with killing his mom and dad. He felt like he hated them, and he blamed them for a lot of his shortcomings, but he just didn't know if he could actually pull the trigger and end their lives. But then, the day after Brad's 57th birthday, Andra had texted Ashton to tell him how disappointed she was that he hadn't even called to wish his father a happy birthday. Ashton, very sarcastically, said that he only forgot it was his dad's birthday because his dad had forgotten he had a second son a long time ago. This led to an argument between Ashton and Andra, and Ashton finally decided at the end of that argument to go through with his plan. On the day before the murders, Ashton had driven his white Prius 18 hours from Seattle to San Juan Capistrano, California. He waited patiently in town for a few more hours, and then he carried out the murders in the early morning. Ashton had arranged for a cab to meet him and take him to the airport, and for a transportation company to drive the Prius back to Seattle and to keep it for him until he was ready to pick it up. So, immediately after the murders, he called that transportation company to verify the address where he would leave the car for them. Then he had dropped the car off in that parking garage, met the cab, and flew home. And it was that phone call to the transportation company that he made right after killing his parents that led police to Ashton. Using cell phone data, they tracked down the owner of the transportation company, and they learned that he had Ashton's white Prius in his possession. Then the search of Ashton's car led police to the murder weapon. When police had initially questioned Ashton, they believed he had been in Seattle on the morning following the murder. But the discovery of the Prius undercut that alibi and made it clear that he would have had time to commit the murders and fly home by the time he had been seen in Seattle. But before police arrested Ashton, they wanted to make sure they had an airtight case that would lead to a conviction. So they dug deeper into his life. It turned out that Ashton had dropped out of college without telling any of his family, and that he had started to isolate himself from most of the people around him. Police also searched his internet history and found all the research on weapons and the different degrees of murder and what each one means, and so police believed they had more than enough evidence against him. When police arrested Ashton, it didn't take long for him to confess. But he made it clear that he had not just killed his parents because he thought they liked Miles better than him. Ashton said his parents had always made him feel like he was weak. He said dating back to the time when he was just a little kid and his baby sister had drowned in the hot tub, his parents didn't seem to care about how upset he was, or even try to get him some help to deal with the grief he was going through. And then, not long before the actual murders, Ashton had gone through this very bad breakup with his girlfriend and gotten really depressed, and he had tried to take his own life by overdosing on painkillers. And Ashton said he felt like his parents didn't really even care. While the other children had a totally different view of Andra and Brad, Ashton felt like murdering his parents was his way of getting revenge on them for all the times they'd made him feel unimportant. Ashton was ultimately found guilty of first-degree murder and attempted murder. He was given 4 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole, plus an additional 100-year sentence for what the court referred to as special circumstances surrounding the use of firearms. As of 2022, Miles, the oldest sibling, was still looking after his younger siblings like he was their parent. And now at 17 years old, Landon, who was paralyzed from being shot, became one of the top 20 wheelchair tennis players in the entire United States, and he hopes one day he'll be able to compete at Wimbledon.
Blue and gold, the stories we are told, but look beyond the street. The rhythm starts to meet 1,000,000 miles away. Defining yesterday, are we just dust in motion, caught in the ocean? No hands upon the dial, we've got more than a wild
So that's going to do it. If you enjoyed today's story, be sure to check out our YouTube channel, just called Mr. Ballin, that has many more stories just like this one,